I came home on a windy afternoon after 10 days in Portland, taking care of my cousin who was recovering from surgery. I dragged my heavy suitcase down the familiar street, exhausted yet relieved to finally return to the place I still believed was my home. I had missed my old armchair, the little kitchen corner, and especially the sense of peace that always greeted me when I walked through the door after a long day. But the moment I turned into the front walkway, I froze. My clothes were scattered across the lawn like trash. The beige sweater I always wore on cold mornings was smeared with dirt. A towel hung over a bush. My winter coat had been thrown nearly 10 feet away. One shoe lay in the middle of the walkway, while the other sat near the trash bin. Everything was soaked with evening dew. I stepped closer and saw a family photo frame lying face down on the ground. When I bent down to pick it up, I found the glass cracked, dirt clinging to the edges. A few steps away, my husband's old blanket, the only thing of his I'd kept for more than 20 years, was stuffed under a wet cardboard box, nearly ruined beyond saving. I stood there, stunned. Then my eyes were drawn to the front door. A note was taped neatly on it, and I recognized the handwriting immediately. Evan's handwriting, my only son. The note said, "Mom, from today, Sophie's parents will be living here. Please find another place. Evan." I read it once, then again, and again, because I couldn't believe the child I spent my youth raising could write something like that. I tried to open the door, but the key wouldn't go in. I tried again and again. There was no mistake. They had changed the lock on the house that was legally mine. I turned toward the street and saw the neighbor across from us pulling her curtain aside to peek at me. When she noticed me looking back, she quickly dropped the curtain as if she'd never been there. The whole neighborhood was so quiet I could hear the wind sweeping across the yard. I wanted to believe this was just a misunderstanding, but deep in my chest, something sharp and cold flickered, a familiar warning of something worse. This wasn't simply letting the in-laws stay. This was a plot, a setup, a betrayal I didn't yet understand. I didn't know things were about to get even worse than that note. My name is Linda Carmichael, and I'm 65. I've been a widow for more than 20 years and raised Evan on my own. I'm gentle, soft-spoken, someone who works more than she talks. And maybe that's why everyone assumes I'm weak, that I'll endure anything without fighting back. But they don't know I've been through far more than they think. I may not be young anymore, but I'm not weak. Before I continue, if you've ever seen an older person mistreated, hit follow. Here we share true stories so everyone knows they deserve respect, at any age. I dragged my suitcase from the yard to the sidewalk and came to a stop. My hands were shaking from exhaustion, but the real trembling came from somewhere deep in my chest. I stood there for a few minutes, taking long breaths, trying to understand what was happening. My home, the place I had lived in for nearly 30 years, the place I thought I would grow old and peacefully, was now throwing me out like an unwanted guest. I looked at the pile of soaked clothes on the lawn one last time before turning away. Each item felt like a blow that pushed me backward. But then there was a moment when I stopped completely, not because of shock anymore, but because a familiar feeling washed over me, the kind every single mother has felt at least once. The past began pulling me back. I lost my husband when I was 40. One winter morning, the police knocked on my door to tell me Edward, my husband, had died in an accident on his way to work. Evan was only 18. He didn't cry much, but he sat on the porch the entire evening, staring into nothing, and I promised myself I would never let him lack anything. From that day on, I did everything I could. I sold baked goods every morning, standing in the cold, sometimes with my hands cracked and bleeding. I took on extra jobs, including packaging goods, making baked goods, and even cleaning houses for a few families in the neighborhood, all so Evan could have tuition, new books, and a lunch like his friends. Evan never knew how many times I fell asleep in the kitchen at 3 a.m., or how I had to soak my hands in warm water every night because of joint pain. But I never complained. Watching him walk into college made every sacrifice worth it. But the truth is, after he married Sophie, I slowly realized I was no longer seen as a mother. I remember once their in-laws hosted a gathering. I stood in the kitchen washing dishes while Sophie and her friends laughed in the living room. When I brought out a tray of plates, Irene, Sophie's mother, glanced around and said reluctantly, "The house is a bit old, isn't it?" I guess Linda's used to living simple. I smiled it off, but the words hit something inside me. That house was something I paid for penny by penny, repaired with my own hands and kept spotless for years. But to them, it was just old. Another time, Sophie was cooking while I walked by to grab a kitchen towel. She let out a loud sigh, the kind people use when someone is in the way. I didn't say anything. I set the towel down and walked out. But that sigh echoed in my head the entire evening. And even on Evan's wedding day, a day every mother hopes to enjoy, I ended up cleaning the living room at night because guests left a mess. Sophie said casually, "Mom, can you help me a little? I'm exhausted." Then she went upstairs to change, leaving me there alone. Neighbors who saw me cleaning just gave awkward smiles and whispered, "Linda's gentle. She's used to it." No one thought I needed help. No one thought any of this was unfair. And now, seeing my belongings thrown into the yard, seeing the lock replaced, I understood I could no longer expect fairness from anyone in that house. I pulled my suitcase to the end of the street and stood up straight. No one would defend me. No one would open that door, so I would have to help myself. I turned and walked to the nearest bus stop, deciding to leave, because I knew if I stayed even one more minute, I would only hurt myself more. I pulled my suitcase out of the old neighborhood and called an Uber. When the car stopped, the driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, helped me put the suitcase in the trunk. But when he saw the mixed bags, he raised an eyebrow slightly as if he wanted to ask what had happened. Yet, like many others, he didn't ask. He just looked at me in the rearview mirror with a curious, slightly pitying expression. I leaned back into the seat. The car drove past streetlights as they came on with the falling dusk. The interior was so quiet I could hear the engine's steady hum and the faint scent of pine-scented wax. The driver glanced up at the mirror occasionally, probably trying to guess why an older woman was sitting in his car with all that luggage at the end of the day. But I didn't explain. I was too tired to speak, and I didn't know where to begin. When the car entered Redwood City, I felt as if I were stepping into a completely different world. Not prettier or classier, but quiet and unfamiliar. The car stopped in front of a 4-story building where I had rented a secret studio for the past 3 years. The driver helped me carry the suitcase up the steps and wished me a peaceful evening. I only managed a grateful smile. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a short hallway. When I opened the door, the smell of a room closed up for days rushed out. A slight dampness mixed with the scent of old wood. I flipped the switch. A weak yellow light came on, illuminating the simple room. A single bed, a tiny kitchenette, a mini fridge, and an old wooden table I'd bought at a thrift store. But this was my place. Mine alone. No one had the right to throw me out here. I sat down on the bed, feeling the old mattress sink beneath me, and then old memories washed over me like a cold wind. 3 years ago. On an afternoon when I was hanging laundry in the yard, the kitchen window was cracked open, and I heard Sophie's voice. At first, I thought she was calling Evan about something, but after a few lines, I froze. "Sooner or later, your mother will have to go to a nursing home. This house is too small for my parents. If we sell the house, we can buy a new one, and putting your mother in a care facility would be the most reasonable option." I remember her voice clearly, confident, not hesitant at all. Evan answered more softly, as if he didn't dare speak loudly. "Sophie, my mother has lived here her whole life. This is a bit much." "Not at all," Sophie cut him off. "You have to think long term. My parents are getting older. They need stable housing. Your mother can get used to anywhere." I stood outside the kitchen window. still holding a wet shirt. My heartbeat drowned out their words. My hands shook uncontrollably and tears fell, but I didn't dare wipe them. I could not let them know I was listening. Evan tried to object, but Sophie kept pressing. And when Evan said, "Let me think about it," I knew it was only a matter of time. That night, sitting alone in my room, I made the most significant decision of my life. The next day, I visited the owner of an old studio in Redwood City. When he quoted a price close to $70,000, I put down all my savings, $38,000, on the table as a deposit. My hands trembled so badly I had to hold the envelope with both palms. Sweat in my palms soaked the edges of the envelope. The landlord looked at me for a moment, then said softly, "I'm selling to you because I believe you'll take care of this place better than I would." The next 3 years were not easy. I made steady monthly payments. There were months I lived on peanut butter sandwiches to make ends meet. Some months my back hurt so much I wanted to see a doctor, but I didn't dare, fearing the cost. But I didn't give up. I persisted. I always believed I needed somewhere to rely on in case things went badly, and now, standing in this small room, I let out a quiet breath. At least, I still have somewhere to go. The following morning, I woke earlier than usual. I hadn't slept all night, not from sadness, but because my mind kept turning around one question. What should I do now? I made an appointment with a lawyer named Howard Parker, whom I found after reading dozens of online reviews. His office sat in an old building on the second floor of a small commercial block. When I walked in, the white neon light shone down on the desk, making the room feel plain but serious. Howard was a man of about 50, wearing black-rimmed glasses and with a direct, clear gaze. He invited me to sit, took the papers I'd brought, and read them carefully. Minutes passed in silence, with only the sound of pages turning and the air conditioner running. Then he put his pen down and spoke plainly, without beating around the bush. "Ms. Linda, what they did is illegal. They have no right to change the locks, no right to throw your belongings out, and certainly no right to demand that you leave the house that's in your name." I felt a weight lift from my chest, but at the same time, a sting. So, I was right. Everything was wrong. I wasn't being paranoid or overly sensitive. They really had treated me as if I had no rights in my own home. Howard continued to explain the legal process. If I wanted to return home, he could file for restoration of possession. In a few days, the police would come to the house and require Evan and Sophie to leave. Afterwards, the house would be fully returned to me with all rights intact. The other option, I could sell the house. Because it was entirely in my name, I had the authority to decide. If I were to sell, I would have to serve notice to Evan and Sophie, give them a specific deadline to vacate, and then the house would be put on the market. Howard looked at me. "It depends on how you want the next chapter of your life to be." I sat quietly. 2 paths appeared in my head, each with gains and losses. If I reclaimed the house, it was the place I'd lived with my husband, the place where I raised Evan, but returning would mean living with Sophie again. I would have to endure sighs, snide remarks, and disapproving looks. I would be back to being the odd older woman in the kitchen, cleaning up after other people's parties. If I sold the house, I would lose the place filled with memories. I would lose the nights I watched the news with Edward, the corner of the yard where Evan learned to walk, all the things tied to my younger years. Howard didn't pressure me. He let me think. Then the image that came to mind wasn't happy days. My belongings were thrown on the lawn. The picture frame is face down. My husband's blanket was soaked under a cardboard box. The cold note taped to the door. I clenched my fist. I knew the answer. "I will sell," I said. "I don't want to go back there." Howard nodded as if he had guessed this choice all along. "Good. I can introduce you to a very reputable broker. He works fast and clearly and will help you get the best price." I inhaled deeply. For the first time in months, I felt myself standing up for myself. Evan came to my studio the next morning. I heard a loud knock as if it had traveled across the city to get there. When I opened the door, Evan stood there, hair messy, eyes red, his face tight with stress. He stepped in and looked around the small room. His expression shifted noticeably, from confused to surprised, then to something indescribable, as if he'd discovered something he'd never imagined. His mother had a place to live he couldn't control. "Mom, you live here?" Evan asked, his voice suddenly small. I only nodded. He stood still for a few seconds and then sighed. "I knew about this apartment before. About 2 years ago, I once accidentally saw paperwork in a cabinet. But I thought, if you had a place to stay, it would be okay." I looked him straight in the eye. "Evan, what do you think I am in that house? A piece of furniture you can move out whenever you want?" He lowered his head, his hands fidgeting awkwardly. "No, Mom, it's not that. It's just Sophie said her parents lost their rental. They had to move quickly. She said it was the only way. She said your mother would understand." I curled my lips slightly. Not a smile, but an unspeakable sadness. "The only way," I repeated. "The only way is to change my lock and throw my things on the grass?" Evan swallowed hard. "Sophie said everything would be temporary. She was really worried. You know, her parents' health isn't good. She kept pushing me to decide right away." I watched my son in silence. The child I'd raised with calloused hands and mornings selling baked goods in the cold wind. The child I always thought would know right from wrong. "Evan," I said slowly, "there are 3 things you did, and I want you to hear them clearly." He looked up. 1, you changed my lock without asking me. Evan bit his lip. 2, you let my belongings be tossed outside like trash. He closed his eyes, tears welling at the corners. 3, you think that because I have this small room, you have the right to decide who my house belongs to. Evan burst into tears, not a child's whine, but the sobbing of someone realizing the wrong he'd done. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I was wrong. Sophie forced me. I didn't know what to do." I took a deep breath. The hurt was there, but I wouldn't let myself soften like before. "Evan, you signed the lock change, not Sophie. You watched them throw my things, not Sophie. You chose to stay silent, and silence is also a choice." He buried his face in his hands. "Mom, what do you want me to do? I'll do anything, so you'll forgive me, so you can come home." I stood up and looked out the window. The light softly washed the wall of the small room, a place where I was respected. "Evan," I said clearly, "I will sell the house." He looked as if the breath had been knocked out of him. "No. Mom, please. Sophie, her parents. We'll have nowhere to—" I turned and looked him squarely in the face. "You will take care of yourselves. Like I once took care of myself." Evan left my studio with heavy steps. I sat down on the bed, and for the first time, I felt I was truly reclaiming the life I had lost. 2 days after the conversation with Evan, Peter, the broker Howard had recommended, and I went to my old house together. Peter was a young man of about 30, tall, articulate, and polite. He carried a tablet, a laser measuring tool, and a thin file folder. As we stepped onto the porch, the door opened within seconds. Sophie stood there, her face drained of color when she saw me. Her expression showed clear surprise and fear, as if she hadn't expected me to actually arrive with a real estate agent. "Linda, what are you doing here?" Sophie asked in a low voice, trembling as if afraid someone inside might hear. I did not answer. I stepped forward slightly and tilted to the side so Peter could enter. Sophie instinctively stepped back. As soon as we entered the living room, Irene immediately appeared from the kitchen, her face tight with tension. She folded her arms across her chest as if readying for a fight. "Linda, this really doesn't need to be made into such a big deal," Irene said, her voice rising with reproach. "We only need time. You demanding to sell the house now, it's really excessive." I remained silent. I reached into my bag, took out the deed, and placed it on the coffee table. The document showed my name alone, the lettering clear and indisputable. Irene saw it and went pale. She pressed her lips together and could not speak. Peter, maintaining a professional demeanor, began his work as if he didn't notice the tension in the room. "We'll measure each room to prepare the valuation report," Peter said gently. He moved from the living room to the kitchen, then down the hallway, reading off measurements clearly each time so I could note them. I followed behind, quiet but composed. Sophie stood pressed against a corner of the wall, her eyes never leaving us. When Peter photographed the living room, Irene tightened her arms and looked at the room as if she might lose something that belonged to her. She breathed heavily, and Sophie lightly placed a hand on her mother's shoulder, as if to console her. Peter continued working in the main bedroom, the room that had been mine before Evan married. I noticed the new curtains, the overpowering scent of floral air freshener, and Sophie's family photos on the shelf. A feeling of estrangement washed over me. The place that had been my home no longer bore any trace of me. When he finished inspecting the whole house, Peter closed his folder and said, "Based on location, the condition of the house, and the current market, I'd value it at about $420,000. If we sell at the right time, it could go a bit higher." The room seemed to catch its breath. $420,000. The number widened Sophie's eyes and left Irene almost stunned. Peter turned to me. "If you agree, I'll list the property for sale this week." I nodded. While Peter packed up his things, Sophie stepped closer to me, her voice trying to remain calm. "Linda, we will leave. We know we were wrong, but please give us more time." I looked at her red-rimmed eyes but said nothing. I simply turned away gently and walked out the door. Peter followed and closed the door behind us. The sound was faint, but to me it felt like the full stop at the end of months of endurance. I went down the steps without looking back. Everything had been decided. That afternoon, while I was folding a few clothes in the little studio, there was a soft knock, as if the person outside didn't dare make much noise. I opened the door and found Sophie standing there. She looked gaunt, her hair hastily tied, eyes swollen red as if she'd cried through the night. "Linda, I beg you, please give us 30 days, she said in a hoarse voice. "My parents haven't found anywhere suitable yet. Evan hasn't slept all week. Everything's a mess." I looked at that weary face, and though my heart softened a little, I could not forget what I had been through. 30 days is not possible, I said slowly, but I can give 15 days, with one condition. Sophie wiped her tears and looked up as if clinging to any hope. "Any condition? Please just give us more time." I straightened and looked her in the eye. "You must tell the truth in front of Evan. Everything. No hiding." Sophie froze for a few seconds. She looked at the floor, her lips trembling. Then she nodded. "All right. I will tell." The next day, Evan and Sophie came to my studio together. They didn't stand close to each other like they used to. Evan's face was tight with stress, and Sophie averted her gaze from her husband. I invited them in. A strip of afternoon sunlight slanted across the floor through the thin curtain. The air was so heavy I could hear the ticking of the clock. I sat down in a chair, and they sat together on the edge of the bed, as if afraid to touch one another. I looked at Sophie and said gently, "You may start." Sophie closed her eyes for a few seconds to gather courage, then spoke. "Evan, I have to tell you the truth. The whole thing about driving your mother out of the house, it was my doing." Evan frowned. "What are you saying?" "I pressured you. I lied that there was no other way. I said my parents had nowhere to go, but in fact they were only asked to move earlier, not forced out." Sophie clenched her hands. "I planned it. I waited until your mother went to Portland to do it. I told you your mother would be fine because she had that apartment. I tried to make you believe it." Evan sprang up from the bed as if someone had choked him. "You pressured me. You said it was a joint decision. You said if we didn't, my parents would be homeless. You made me believe my mother had another place so it would be okay." "I know." Sophie's voice broke. "I just wanted my parents nearby. I didn't think it would turn out like this. I was selfish." Evan slapped his forehead and paced back and forth in the small room. "Why did you do that? My mother lived in that house her whole life. You made me drive my own mother out of her home." Sophie bowed her head, tears streaming down her face. "I was wrong. I know I was wrong. Linda, I'm sorry. I truly am sorry." I watched them, two people who had dragged each other into this spiral. Evan trembled, and Sophie shrank like a scolded child. But inside me, there was no longer a flare of anger, only an apparent calm. "I've heard enough," I said. They turned to look at me. "I understand everyone has their reasons," I continued. "But what happened to me cannot be undone. The house will be sold. That decision will not change." No one said anything further. There was no need. Evan bowed his head. Sophie wiped her tears. They rose and left. As they walked down the narrow stairs from the studio, both were silent, no longer arguing, no longer blaming, only the heavy footsteps of two people who had lost something larger than they had imagined. 2 weeks after Sophie's confession, I received a call from Peter. "Ms. Linda, the Harris family has made an offer. They want to buy the house for $435,000 with a quick closing." I sat still for a moment. That number was much higher than the initial valuation. It wasn't that I was greedy. It was the sense that the pain I had endured was finally being compensated in some way. The signing took place in a brightly lit room, on a long wooden table with the documents neatly arranged. As I flipped through each page to sign, the soft, crisp sound of paper echoed like the closing of a long chapter in my life. The Harris family, a middle-aged couple and their daughter preparing to start her own household, shook my hand sincerely. "We'll take good care of the house," Mrs. Harris said. I smiled. "I hope so." After the signing, I went to the bank to check my account. When the screen lit up and the large number appeared clearly, I had to take a deep breath. A woman who once counted every penny while buying groceries, now had enough money to live comfortably, without anyone pitying me or trying to control me ever again. In the days that followed, I began doing something I had waited far too long to do, rebuilding my life. The small studio in Redwood City began to undergo gradual changes. I painted the walls a warm cream color, making the room feel brighter and cozier. I bought a new sofa, small but comfortable, the kind that wraps around your body when you sit down. I replaced the kitchen cabinet with a compact yet spacious one, allowing me to store everything neatly. I changed the bed sheets to soft fabric that relaxed me the moment I lay down. With each item placed in its spot, the room felt alive again. And so did I. My mornings became slow and gentle. I didn't have to rush to cook for anyone or do laundry on anyone's schedule. I filled the kettle, waited for it to boil, and brewed a cup of coffee just strong enough. I opened the window and took a long breath, letting the light traffic of Redwood City blend with the scent of hot coffee. Life flowed quietly and peacefully from there. After a month of settling in, I decided to fulfill a dream I had postponed for more than 20 years. I booked a ticket to Florida. When I stood on Clearwater Beach, the wind blowing through my hair, the salt brushing my skin, and the sound of seagulls overhead, I let my bare feet touch the calm waves. I was no longer the mother who had been disrespected, no longer the woman abandoned on her own doorstep. I was just Linda, a free woman, 65 years old, stepping back into life. After Florida, I continued on to Georgia. I spent afternoons walking through old squares, under rows of trees casting long shadows, listening to stories from local residents. No one hurried me home. No one waited for me to clean up. I moved at my own pace. One morning in Savannah, I sat in a small cafe beneath an old tree. That was when I met Richard Hale, a man about my age, also sitting alone with a cup of black tea. He spoke first. Traveling alone? Not many people our age dare to do that. I smiled. I'm just learning how to live for myself. My answer made Richard smile, as if he understood all too well. We talked for quite a while. He told me he, too, had been hurt by his children, who had pushed him out of important decisions in his own family. I thought I was the only one, he said. I looked at him and saw something familiar in his eyes, the pain of older people who have been overlooked, yet still have the strength to stand up again. We made no promises. We didn't need to. Just two people who had survived loss, finding understanding in a quiet morning. For me, that was enough. The news of Evan and Sophie's divorce didn't come to me through a call or a message. It came directly from Evan on a lightly rainy afternoon. But even before that, I had sensed it coming. Too many things had pushed their marriage to the edge. Evan recounted something that left me silent for a long moment. One evening, after months of arguments, Evan stood outside Sophie's parents' house. The cold wind whipped his coat. Inside, Sophie and her mother were arguing about how Evan didn't understand his wife's family, while Evan stood outside holding the railing, his eyes red. Mom, I stood there for almost 2 hours just trying to understand what I had lost. But in the end, I knew I had to walk away. And he did. He left the house that was never truly his, left the life he once thought was family. Divorce became something they both eventually came to agree upon. After the divorce, Evan came to see me many times, but I held my boundaries clearly. You can only come on weekends, I said, and you're not staying overnight. I want things clear. Evan nodded, even though I knew it hurt him, but he accepted it. Mom, I know you need to protect yourself. I understand. I set one more rule. No mentioning Sophie in our conversations. Evan hesitated at first, but then said, Okay, I'll respect that. So each weekend, Evan sat in the small chair by the window, telling me about work, about renting a small room near his job, about trying to cook for himself so he wouldn't have to eat instant noodles every night. Once I saw him dozing off on my sofa, but I didn't let him stay. I gently tapped his shoulder. Go home, son. You must always take care of your own life. He gave me a sad smile and nodded. One autumn afternoon, the two of us sat in a park near my place. Yellow leaves fell around us, and children played in the distance. Evan sat with his head down, hands twisting together. Mom, I haven't slept well in months, he said, voice tight. Not because of Sophie, but because I feel like I betrayed you. I sighed softly. Evan, I don't want you tormenting yourself forever, but I want you to remember this. Respecting your parents is not optional. It is natural. He nodded, tears rolling down, but his voice lighter. I'm learning. Just let me learn at my own pace. We sat there for a long time, saying nothing more, and in that silence, I knew healing was happening. Slowly but surely. During this time, I wrote a book. The title I chose was The Day I Stood Up at 65. I wrote simply, recounting my journey of being pushed out of my home and then saving my own life. I never expected the little book to be read by so many people. Letters poured in from everywhere, from people in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s. They told me their children tried to take their homes. They cried while reading my story because they saw themselves in it. They thanked me for saying what so many were afraid to say. One letter I remember most was from Lucy, a 70-year-old woman. She wrote that her daughter wanted to transfer the apartment into her own name and planned to send her to a nursing home. I called her the very next day. Lucy, you're not alone, I said. I'll help you find a lawyer and understand your rights. A few weeks later, I heard Lucy had kept her apartment. She cried on the phone, thanking me for helping her see her own worth. And in that moment, I realized what I went through was not just to save myself, it was so I could guide others as well. Sometime later, Evan told me he was getting to know someone new. I listened without rushing to be happy or suspicious. I had learned to observe instead of believing everything at first glance. The day Evan brought Clara to meet me, I felt a bit nervous, but she spoke first. "Hello, Miss Linda. Evan has told me so much about you. I've been hoping to meet you for a long time." Her voice was gentle, her eyes respectful. No awkwardness, no pretension. Clara asked if I wanted something to drink and inquired about the kind of flowers I liked so she could bring them next time. Small things, but things I had never once felt from Sophie. I remained cautious, but warmth spread through me. Evan had grown wiser in choosing the person beside him. After the meeting, Evan asked, "Mom, what do you think of Clara?" I answered simply, "Treat well the person who respects your family." Evan nodded, a more mature nod than at any point in all the years before. As for Richard Hale and me, our relationship remained as gentle as those Savannah mornings. We had no demands, no binding expectations. Richard sometimes visited me in Redwood City. We would walk together, have lunch, and share old stories. Sometimes I visited him in Georgia, each meeting a peaceful little trip. We both understood that at our age, the most precious thing is not a tightly bound relationship, but the feeling of being respected, being heard, and having companionship without pressure. One thing I realized clearly after everything: growing old does not mean being weak. Growing old does not mean being dependent. Growing old does not mean becoming a burden. Independence in old age is not only about money. It is independence in thought, choosing how you want to live, who you allow into your life, and what you want for yourself. Many nights I sat by the window of my studio, watching the lights of Redwood City below. Cars moved slowly down the street. The breeze brushed through the thin curtain. No voices were calling me to clean up, no sighs of annoyance when I accidentally dropped a spoon. Only peace surrounded me. Some evenings, Richard would call, "Linda, what are you doing?" I'd answer, "I'm enjoying an evening without having to worry about anyone." He laughed. "Sounds like a gift." It was, a gift I gave myself. I came to understand that family is love, but love without respect becomes a burden. Older people are not obstacles in their children's lives. Older people deserve to be asked, to be heard, to be treated with kindness. And I understood one more thing. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's choosing to unburden your heart so you can live better. I forgave Evan, but I did not forget what happened. I forgave because I wanted to keep living, not because I needed to endure. A family can break, but it can also heal with sincerity. Evan now visits me every weekend, a reminder that he has truly grown. He no longer shies away from responsibility or blames others. He has learned to apologize, to repair, and to love with respect. I look at him, and I see hope. If someone asked me the greatest lesson I learned after all the turmoil, it would be this: I started over at 65, and anyone can.